Marvel Snap's newest card, Strange Supreme, is receiving a rousing welcome, with many people hailing it as the best card to come out this month. But how good is it actually? Let's take a look at the decks that are currently playing Strange Supreme and talk about whether or not it's a good idea to invest in this very weird 2-drop scaler. Strange Supreme is a 2/2 that gains 2 power every time it merges. At the end of every turn, it looks on your board for created card and then merges with that card. Created cards that are common in Marvel Snap include the squirrels from Squirrel Girl, the stones from Thanos, Arishem created cards, and of course, if your opponent sends over an acid arrow, well, it doesn't matter that that was created in their hand, it's still a created card. Now, merge here might be a little bit confusing for some. I saw some confusion about this. Merge means it gets the stats of the card and then it gets the +2. It does not keep any abilities that the card has. It just eats the stats, sort of like a Venom almost, is sort of how you want to think about this guy. What he's doing is consuming the stats of the things he merges with, and every time he merges with something, he gets an additional 2. In terms of raw power, this guy can get very large. It's not the most common thing in the world, but I've had a 30 power Strange Supreme. This is a card that gets big. It is a big boy, but that comes with upsides and downsides because you are typically investing pretty heavily in this card in order for it to get that big. It is eating things that might actually be helpful to you. Like in Thanos, those stones are actually pretty good if you're playing Goliath and Dazzler. Or in a deck playing the Hood, that demon, you might need that 6 power somewhere, and this guy makes it unreliable and gets your guys Shang-Chi'd. That is ultimately the biggest risk of this card, is Shang-Chi and Shadow King. So a lot of Strange Supreme decks right now are going to contain ways to mitigate that, primarily Cosmo as a general rule. This is a high investment strategy. The more you invest into Strange Supreme, the more he eats, the bigger he gets for 2. But the more vulnerable he is to the very powerful tech cards that are able to deal with something of that size. For this reason, I think he is less comparable to something like Scream, which is just a flat-out beast because half of her scaling is not even on her. So if she gets Shang-Chi'd, she still has applied all those minuses to people. Or even a Sam Wilson. This is much more a build-around card where you have to account for his own general weakness. A lot of people are calling this similar to Scream. I do think that on the whole, if you gave me 2 buckets, one bucket had Kahori and Goliath in it, and the other bucket had Scream and Sam Wilson in it, I would probably put this guy into the Kahori and Goliath bucket if we're talking about power level. However, it is also worth mentioning that Scream was not a card that people thought was as good as she ended up being. It took a while for people to sort of figure out her power. And this is a card that has the ability to perhaps get stronger as people figure out how to build around it properly and what they should be doing to optimize his power and to protect him as a very powerful large scaler. In terms of deck building, by far my most successful list with this card was Thanos. This was a list that was so good, you're probably going to get a full breakdown on it tomorrow, because that is genuinely how awesome it was. I climbed from rank 17 to rank 14, which sounds like not a lot, but it's actually like 120 SP. Basically playing just this list. It is a very powerful thing to be doing right now, but it is also worth asking yourself the question, what are the reasons to play this version of Thanos compared to the ongoing version of Thanos? And is building in this way, this sort of tech soup thing, a long-term viable thing or a reaction to other people playing Strange Supreme? There are a pretty vast amount of tech cards in this list. We have Shang-Chi, we have, of course, Shadow King, we have Cosmo, we have Goliath. It's very much a tech pile Thanos list, and that makes us as a deck feel a lot more reliant on Wiccan than the other builds of this list that focus on ongoing cards. I don't believe that Strange Supreme is a good fit in those ongoing Thanos lists, in large part because it's not just a direct one-to-one with him versus Goliath comparing whether or not you want the stones on the board or not. The ongoing Thanos lists don't just have Goliath that wants the stones, they have Dazzler that wants the stones so that the board gets full. They have Blue Marvel that wants the stones because it wants more things on the board. They have Spectrum that wants the stones so that it can hit more things with her buff. This is a card that sort of necessitates you opting to go a different direction with your Thanos list. And to be clear, I think Thanos is good enough to support two archetypes, but a lot of the time when there are two archetypes, the one that comes out ahead is the one that has more baseline power because it ends up winning the heads up. I think this deck is very good, but I am not incredibly confident in the pseudo mirror against ongoing Thanos lists. To me, it feels like if both of you are drawing about the same level, then they're just gonna have more points than you a lot of the time. You are able to do very powerful things with this list, but you are generally gonna be having less points at your top end. Goliath is a great card. I don't want to sit here and disparage the purple fart cloud, but in the ongoing Thanos deck, Spectrum plays for like 20 power. It's just a little bit more in terms of the actual numbers that hit the board. That said, this deck matches up very well into the current metagame as long as you don't run into that Thanos stuff. What Strange Supreme does is make this deck a lot more well-rounded, and he does that in a couple of different ways. The first is that he makes you a little bit less vulnerable to Clog, because the things that you play on your board that end up clogging you when they do that are generally things that he's going to be able to eat. That is very good for Thanos. In addition, he makes you a little bit less vulnerable to Killmonger, because he's going to be eating some of these guys before the Killmonger actually goes off. Whereas the ongoing Thanos list is very vulnerable to both of those cards. One of the things that really sticks out when I play this is I don't know if I need all the tech cards. Maybe there's a middle ground to be found. I could absolutely believe that this card ends up being a Thanos staple purely on the upside it gives you against Clog, which is a very metagame relevant matchup and one that is specifically very tough for you as a Thanos player. In terms of the matchups he swings, that is the one that's really gonna stick out. There are some downsides though. For example, he can eat your Sam Wilson shield and will do that fairly often. That can be an upside. Let's say you didn't draw Sam, you at least get to convert it into 3 points. That's kind of nice. You can't complain about that. But there's other stuff too. Like him eating stuff conflicts a lot of the time with your ability to get a cheap Mockingbird. And you have to choose a lot of the time between getting that cheap Mockingbird down early and getting that Strange Supreme down. When you're really going off, you can do both of those things, but he does eat the things that make Mockingbird work in your deck. This also is a deck that is very energy hungry. Our top end is very heavy. Our Mockingbird is not as cheap as the full spam lists because of what Strange Supreme is doing. This means that we end up even more reliant on Wiccan. Wiccan is a very important card here to enable us to contest multiple lanes on the final turn of the game because we don't have Spectrum and we don't have Blue Marvel and we don't have the ability to do that with one card on the final turn of the game. We pretty much have to be playing multiple cards. That said, all of this tech in this list is very, very powerful and gives you a generally solid matchup into most decks in the game. This is a safe choice in a metagame that is not necessarily incredibly well understood. You're going to be good into other Strange Supreme decks because of all your tech, and this is generally a deck that feels extremely well-rounded right now, but has been messing around with more all-in Strange Supreme lists. I'm going to give you a little bit of a leak or a peek behind the scenes at our secret chat, but actually kind of already thinks that this card should be nerfed to 2-0. Every time I talk to him about it, he says, no, this card is really busted. And this is basically the shell he's been playing as far as I'm aware. A misery Firehair Strange Supreme deck that is just going all in on Strange Supreme is going to be the biggest guy possible. And then, you know, the rest of the time I'll have a cheap death. I'll have my Killmonger for the Thanos games. And of course I have my demons, although it's not easy to count on them because because of the fact that they are very often going to be eaten by Strange Supreme. You do have some little iffy games towards the end, which is part of where death becomes a very important part of this list. We have a bunch of different ways to just cycle power here, using things like Strange Supreme to unclog ourselves, using those things in order to decrease the cost of our death. All of these cards have multiple uses. Strange Supreme can eat the squirrels, or you can blow them up. You can also repeat the squirrels with a Firehair so that you have more things for Strange Supreme to eat. Stuff like that is legit. Like, there's a lot of different intricate and weird things that this list can do. Fundamentally, though, what it's trying to do is be a sort of alt version of the V-Hand list, where our power comes from Strange Supreme rather than V-Hand, so it's much more vertical and much less evenly distributed. My boy Husky Puppies was messing around with a version of the Cook, of course, the Mysterio Mockingbird Sasquatch list, that I think is a potential serious home for this card. This is the kind of list, if not the exact 12, honestly, give or take a Nico, that when this card came out, I thought would be the predominant mode of play. This being able to chomp every turn on Mysterios while still enabling them to give their cost discounts is a genuinely nice thing to do. Yes, there is a bit of anti-synergy in that Mysterio, whichever one is the real one, will not give him 4 power. All the Mysterios will be 0 power when he eats them, so it's 0 plus his natural 2. But that is still generally worth the price of admission here, because you are going to be able to use these Squirrel Girls and Mysterios to discount your Mockingbird, and typically when you do that, you end up very screwed on board space. It's just not a viable thing to continue doing. However, he unscrews your board space, and he does so in a way that makes him a powerful threat. Of all the decks that we've played Strange Supreme in, or that I've seen people play Strange Supreme in, this is the one where it feels like this is his most natural fit. It feels like this is a situation that they expected to come up when making this card in the first place. And I think it is a very reasonable addition to this list. But ultimately, the question with Strange Supreme is going to be whether the juice is worth the squeeze. Cards I expect to see a lot of with Strange Supreme are cards like Cosmo and Juggernaut that are going to be able to protect him on the final turns of the game. It should not be a surprise that there's a lot of Shadow Kings and Shang-Chi's running around in a metagame where a card like this just came out. When he's not checked by these tech cards, he can be extremely powerful, and that means that you kind of need to be building such that you are able to counter the counters. And once you have to do that, then it really becomes a question of if the juice is worth the squeeze. He's good, but is he worth all of that? And I think that's an interesting question. Another high infinite gamer, Honifer, has been messing around with the deck, or with the card in Supreme Surfer. Now, this is just leaning into him in just sort of the barest amount, which is to say, we have a couple of cards that are going to reasonably trigger him, but we're not squirrel girling or anything. We're not like overly investing in that. But what I do like about the way this list is put together, and give or take maybe one of the 2s for another 3, all of that stuff, what I do like is that for once in Surfer's life, it's actually like playing enough 2s to make me feel good about actually not guaranteed having a play on 2, but like once you get 4, you are going to be able to actually play games of Marvel Snap in ways that like previously you weren't. I will say that as a deck builder, I tend towards the versions of decks that are more consistent, and I generally do like this. I would not be shocked if we ended up, drop a 2, play a Cassandra Nova, something like that, right? Like, it wouldn't shock me because we do care about the volume of 3s. Drop a 2, play a Gladiator. There's plenty of things you could do, right? But I do like that this deck is not only very often able to have a play on turn 2, but also to be able to play a 2+3 on turn 5. And I think that's pretty helpful as well. This is a deck that is looking to sort of minimally invest into the Surfer plan, which is not to say not invest into the Surfer plan, just minimally invest into the Surfer plan, while also playing good cards that scale upwards and get benefits from your Galacta, from your Gwenpool. It's just a very powerful thing to be doing right now. There's a lot of stats in this deck. It can be very confusing to play against, and Strange Supreme eating something like a, Mr. Sinister clone is usually going to be a pretty good outcome for you because you, as a deck, are pretty board space starved. So what Strange Supreme is doing here is clearing up your board space and allowing you to invest further. I just did a video talking about the ways in which we need to think about things in Marvel Snap with regards to investment and what investment allows you to do. One of the things that I really wanted to harp on in that video that I'll only briefly mention here is that the bigger a card is on its own without taking up extra board spaces, the better it is, in part because it allows you to invest further in that lane. Something like Brood typically precludes massive further investment. Not all of it, but some of it, right? Now, with Strange Supreme, he clears up some of those things and allows you to do, maybe he ate one of the Broodlings and you get to play 2 cards in that lane with the Broodlings, right? That's the kind of stuff where it can be really valuable to have a card like Strange Supreme sort of really competing heavily on the cost or power per space axis. Just a couple of other decks to talk about. I've seen people playing Strange Zoopreme. I'm fairly pessimistic on this. I think that it ends up not being what the deck wants to be about. Part of what makes Zoo so compelling is that it's not an easy deck to Shang-Chi. And when you are doing what this deck wants you to do with Strange Supreme, he suddenly goes from being a strength to being a bit of a weakness, in my opinion. I'm not saying that makes him bad or anything in this context, but I do think that this is not the card that is going to bring Zoo back from the brink by really any means. I think this is a card that may be a side grade, maybe a small upgrade, but he comes with real costs in this list. It should come as no surprise that many people are attempting to do Clog things with Strange Supreme because he does seem like a pretty logical thing to go with a debris, right? That's a very strong thing to do. We've seen that pop up a couple other times. The thing is that when your opponents are also playing Strange Supreme, investing in that stuff feels kind of stupid because, okay, you gave them 2 things that they get to munch on with Strange Supreme. I haven't seen a very coherent version of the Strange Supreme deck just yet. And I'll say another thing for this. There's a lot of tension between Strange Supreme and Sentry Annihilus because he will eat that -8. Like, he will munch that up too, or -9. And that is awful when that happens and you sort of feel like you're priced into doing that. It's not the greatest thing on earth. Now, maybe you'll send him over with Annihilus because he's just that small, but frankly, I'd rather send over the -9. I have seen Strange Supreme in other builds of Clog as well, and I strongly suspect that those might end up being not necessarily better fits for him, but by virtue of being better decks at baseline, cutting 1 card from the Clog deck from Sunday's video, and then putting Strange Supreme in probably isn't going to take you that far afield. The problem is, Strange Supreme is actually pretty good against Clog, which still remains to be seen how that's going to balance out in the metagame, but it certainly feels to me that there are probably more decks right now between Strange Supreme itself and the way you can build around it with stuff like this or with Misery. There's kind of a lot of anti-Clog in the meta, and that's a nice and interesting development for this metagame to have, and I'm interested to see where it goes. So right now, I don't think I would be interested in trying to be the Clogger because there's kind of a lot of unclog right now. The question of whether Strange Supreme is worth buying is actually very interesting because this is, in theory, unless they mess up the rollout, the last Spotlight cache that we will ever have access to. If you also want the other cards in the cache, those are Speed and US Agent, it can be worth investing in. Now, I say can be because it is relative. Keep in mind that every key you spend is 3,000 tokens in the new system. So if you are missing, let's say, 2 cards, and you 4-bang in order to acquire Speed and Strange, that is about the rate of if those cards were in the new Series 5 pack. That's not exact, but it's pretty close because you 4-bang, it's 12,000, you get the 2,000 back, you get your little rebate. It's kind of in the range of that. So, that's your low roll. You could high roll. It's entirely possible. If you aren't interested or you already own Speed and US Agent, I find it hard to believe that it's worth investing here, because if you invest more than 2, you might as well have just gone and bought it for 6,000 under the new system. The average is 2.5. Obviously, it's not like literal, right? The average is going to be 2 or 3 a lot of the time. But generally speaking, the math is in favor of not spending your keys and then just going and getting it for 6,000 when the new system hits, if you actually want it. You should also keep in mind that there is an OTA coming on Thursday. That's a very relevant thing to think about as well. So, this card is legit, and I think a lot of people have hyped it maybe a bit more than I am personally willing to. In part because I'm higher on stuff like Goliath and Kahori than others are, but also in part because I think that this card plays stronger or looks stronger than it actually is. I'm here to give what I view as a bit of caution. I'm not saying this card isn't great, but what I am saying is that I don't believe that it is Scream. Not yet. I will need to see a lot more out of this card before I'm willing to start believing that it is the kind of thing that Scream is, or that Sam Wilson is. To me, this card feels like almost a fixed version of those cards. It is asking you to do things that are very out of the norm, in most cases that aren't Thanos, of course. But in exchange for you doing those things, it's paying you off with massive power. I basically think they nailed it. Like, this is an Agamotto level success for me, if I'm looking at this in terms of balance. This is a card that is asking you to do something very odd. Squirrel Girl is not a good card for a wide variety of reasons related not just to the economy of playing the card, but also to board space and things like that. This is a card that is making people play Squirrel Girl and making them a little bit more successful for doing it. The only thing that I think holds it back is that it is asking so much more of you than a card like Scream, and it is paying you off, I'm not going to say less, but I do think less, because at least it is paying you off in a way that is generally positive for you. You're unclogging your own board, but it is so much more vulnerable to tech cards. Scream has the massive advantage of her power being distributed and generally not being big enough to get hit by Shang-Chi. This means that tech cards are a less than complete solution to her. Whereas a card like Shadow King, a card like Shang-Chi, is a complete solution to Strange Supreme, and it often sort of exposes the weakness inherent in a lot of these decks, which is, once the Strange Supreme gets blown up, you fed it like 6 things or 5 things or however many things you fed it. Those all effectively got blown up too when he gets blown up. And that means that you have to be very cautious about how much you're willing to invest in this card. He will pay you off. You will make some big numbers. But you do have to be very wary, because I don't know if we've ever had a card that's been as vulnerable to tech cards as this guy is. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and we will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and I do need to remind everyone, I have a podcast. If you want to check it out, it's linked in the description, the KMBest Podcast with Magic the Gathering legend Jerry Thompson, someone who I am very grateful to call a friend. We talk every week about Marvel Snap, and then mostly also about not Marvel Snap, so, you know, your mileage may vary. We tend to get a little bit sidetracked as two dudes with ADHD that are, at least one of us, me, is unmedicated. Fairly common thing to happen. I really enjoy it, though. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next one.